Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So, taking out a fun and interesting episode for you guys today, because we now have the news that an apparent third add-on to the Sega Saturn was in development to increase the overall 3D capabilities of the Saturn hardware. And in the past in the channel, I've talked about both Lockheed Martin's attempt at having either a Saturn II or a Saturn add-on, as well as the fact that Sega and the 3DO company almost went into business together to release the 3DO M2 as either a Saturn hardware add-on or even a successor console. But now, thanks to Beat Magazine, an online publication that I will leave a link for in the description below, one of the engineers that worked on the project is also talking about a Hitachi SH-3 add-on that was in development for the Saturn, going so far as to say that when they were working on Shenmue for the Saturn, this hardware was actually utilized for some of the demos. It's one of those things, Sega always loved to try to make add-on hardware, and if you're ever wondering why Sega got into a financial crisis during the Dreamcast era, I'm pretty sure it's the fact that they had basically 3, 4, 5 different hardware consoles as well as add-ons in development at the same time, none of which actually ever saw the light of day. But this is definitely fun news, so we're going to be covering it. Before I get too far involved though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, I got a Patreon link down below as well. And again, I recommend buying Beep stuff on this. I am not showing it in the video, and again, it is going to be in Japanese, so of course with translation, you're going to be losing a little bit of something. But they're talking about here a Hitachi SH-3 base power-up or add-on for the Sega Saturn. Now if that sounds familiar, the Hitachi SH-2 was in both the Sega 32X as well as the Sega Saturn, and then the Hitachi SH-4 ends up becoming the CPU for the Dreamcast, so it really isn't that weird that this was the chip that could have been in this add-on. Now when we take a look at some of the only demo footage of Shenmue running on Sega Saturn hardware, or at least internal tests, you can see here it definitely has a very big Saturn vibe. And I know everyone's going to ask the question, is this developed just for the base Saturn or for some sort of potential add-on? The reality is, it is impossible to say. We can definitely take a look around the edges and see if anything looks different than what Sega Saturn hardware would be doing, but again, this is presumptive, it isn't a guarantee in either direction. What I will say is, in this tech demo and in this sample that Sega actually made back in the day, there does seem to be a little bit better geometry as far as the actual warping is concerned. If you watch some of the edges of the screen, it has more of a perspective correct sort of texture look to it versus what we would see on actual Sega Saturn hardware. And some of the models, including Ryo, look a little bit higher polygon than you would expect. Now, of course, an SH-3 is a CPU. It really isn't going to be super effective for doing a lot of the 3D on Sega Saturn. Of course, you still have VDP-1 and VDP-2, and while it can aid in giving you better 3D, I would highly imagine that this add-on must have had some sort of other video chip on board to kind of increase the overall graphical capabilities of the Saturn. If you take a look at the Super H, stands for Super Hitachi or SH series of CPUs. They were just 32-bit CPUs that ended up being popular both in arcade gaming as well as for Sega as far as their home consoles are concerned. And we talk about the Dreamcast, that is a Hitachi SH-4 CPU, and it's not surprising Sega went that route because all their in-house developers were very familiar with using this CPU because they had been using it on the Sega Saturn and even the 32X. And even though they used other CPUs for the actual arcade market, those parts are a little bit too big, a little too expensive to try to water down into a home console. But again, as we take a look at the Shenmue demo footage, I have an inkling that maybe at least some of this may have been developed with a more powerful Saturn as the development kit. Again, there's absolutely no way to definitively say that because none of the information that was gleaned online from Beep was it ever stated that this trailer was based on that hardware. I'm just saying based upon the look and the overall graphical fidelity and lack of warping, kinda has that feel to it. And you'll see here the Hitachi SH-3 was just an improvement of the SH-2 with a little bit better memory management as well as a DSP or digital signal processor extension added in. And it's one of those things, the Hitachi SH-2 and SH-4 will sound familiar if you are a Sega fan, but the Hitachi SH-3 really isn't a chip that you hear much about. It actually got used in a couple of satellites in space, but it also got used for one arcade board that I feel like no one actually knows the specs on, even if you know the games. Leave me a comment down below and you tell me before you see the game if you can guess it, but this is the one board that actually used Hitachi SH-3. So the one actual gaming use of the Hitachi SH-3 comes in the Cave CV1000B and CV1000D arcade boards, and interestingly enough, you're not really going to get a good sense of what it can do for 3D, because every single one of these games is going to be in 2 dimensions. So as far as it actually getting a use case for gaming, it does exist. As far as that use case actually being helpful to explain what the power would have been, absolutely not useful, at least in the 3D realm of things. And honestly, this is not surprising, because I've done so many different videos talking about the fact that Sega had so many different potential partnerships with different companies out there to either try to improve the Sega Saturn or to have a successor console to the Saturn. My favorite obviously being their deal with the 3DO company to purchase the 3DO M2 technology. I've actually talked to engineers that were in the room that worked at the 3DO company back in the day, and Sega basically walked away from this at the absolute last minute because at IBM, when they fabricated the test chips, they actually forgot a layer of copper, so it didn't have direct access to the RAM. As opposed to running at 30 to 60 frames per second, it was running about 1 frame every few seconds. So Sega basically didn't want to wait around, and they completely disregarded the deal, which unfortunately is a bummer to me. Now, if we go to other period articles here, also Lockheed Martin was involved talking about a Saturn II or a Saturn hardware add-on for games like Virtua Fighter 3. That is the other game mentioned in the Beep articles that was in development for this potential Sega TRIP add-on board using a Hitachi SH-3 CPU. So the question is the TRIP also the thing that was involved with Lockheed Martin? It is basically impossible to say, but there was rumors out there of basically every single manufacturer trying to get a deal with Sega to either improve the Saturn or to make a successor console. Because even though I love the Saturn and it can do good 3D, it was always a 2D system that had 3D added on, and PlayStation was basically eating Sega's lunch. But I think the reason why a lot of this just didn't go through is the fact that you had an incredible looking Virtua Fighter 3 on Sega Model 3 hardware in arcades, and because the actual home conversions of the original Virtua Fighter were so widely panned as being inferior to the arcade, I think Sega was just thinking about this from a PR perspective. They wanted basically an arcade perfect, air quotes, version of Virtua Fighter 3 on a home console. They did not, at least in my opinion, want to put another game out into the universe that was a massive step down from what it would have looked like had you played in arcades. And if you use the Sega Saturn hardware as a base, even with add-ons, I don't think you're getting anywhere near the level of performance that you see here, and I'm sure that's in part why it was cancelled. But watch some of this Shenmue footage, go ahead and listen to the audio, and definitely take a look at the overall warping or lack thereof, and I'll be right back. I mean, that's super impressive stuff, and at least in my opinion, it feels like it could be using a potential add-on board for the Saturn, because again, I'm drawn to the fact that none of the polygons are technically quads, because someone always leaves that comment down below. They don't really seem to be warping. Now, it is possible that they put the camera far enough away that if they did warp at the edges, you don't really notice it, but there's just something about that footage that feels like it's punching slightly above the Sega Saturn's weight. But again, I don't think any add-on using the Saturn as a base would be able to get even close to what Virtua Fighter 3 looked like in arcades, and again, I'm sure that's not what Sega wanted to invest in. But this has always been a very fun curiosity, Shenmue on Saturn before it moved over to the Dreamcast. And again, Ryo's face there just looks like it has more polygons than you would expect to see on the Sega Saturn. And this next shot of Ryo's face, I feel like there's way too much geometry here, especially in that rounding of the chin, even though it is a quick shot, to be able to be pulled off by just the Sega Saturn. But you leave me a comment down below and you tell me how you feel about it. And before you say it was done on a dev kit, those are more powerful. They usually have double the RAM until debug basically brings that RAM down to the amount that could be used on a console, but generally you don't have increased 3D graphical capabilities, because what would be the point of that, developing something that you knew full well would never display on the Saturn hardware? So my gut tells me this actually could very well be something that was developed with that add-on board in mind, because that SH-3 and the additional DSP could be used for some of the actual arithmetic or math to get some of these polygons set up. but again, we're never going to know because Sega had so many different things going on. This could be something like a SH-3 with some sort of Lockheed Martin chip. It could be an in-house developed chip. It could just be a slight mismemory from the actual person talking, and this could have been something that had way more than an SH-3 on it. You leave me your thoughts down below, but we're done. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.